Happy Thursday. Also, birthday shout out to Owen. But back again with Ranger in Time, D-Day Battle on the Beach. So yesterday where we left off, Walt, one of the soldiers, was running and Ranger followed him. So we're on chapter 5 and it's called Rescue from the Sea. Walt couldn't run very fast with the weight of his wet pack, so Ranger caught up quickly. Walt didn't look down. His eyes were trained on the water. He didn't stop when he reached the waves. He splashed in, sinking into the wet sand in his boots. Soon it was up to his waist, plunging his arm into the waves. Ranger bounded into the sea too. A wave swept his paws out from under him. He paddled against the current, struggling to keep his nose out of the water. The air was thick with smells, salt water, and smoke, chemicals and blood and fear. Ranger caught Walt's scent mixed with the smells of the other men. Ranger could tell some of those men were still in the water. Again, Walt reached deep into the crashing waves. This time he tugged and staggered back. He pulled again and lugged a soldier from the water by the arm. The man was shorter than Walt, but much heavier. Ranger wanted to help, but all he could do was watch as Walt dragged the man to the beach. Walt net and pounded the man's chest. He blew 2 long breaths into the man's mouth. Walt did that again and again until the man coughed up water and rolled onto his side. "Come on!" Walt tugged at the man's arms, pulling him to his feet. "Get to cover!" Walt held the man up as they staggered back to the rocky ditch and collapsed. One of the other soldiers clapped Walt on the shoulder. "You saved him!" Ranger waited for Walt to go back to help the other men, but Walt reached for his pack. Ranger barked. There were more men still out in the water. 2 of them. Ranger had smelled their sweat and their breath and their fear, but he couldn't save them without Walt's help. Ranger barked again. Walt ignored him. Or maybe he couldn't hear over the rattling gunfire that still pounded at the beach. Ranger pawed at Walt. He jumped on him and pushed him with his front legs. Walt swatted him away. "Get out of here, dog!" But Ranger barked again. He jumped out of the ditch and ran toward the water. Then he ran back to Walt, barking. He ran back and forth until finally Walt turned and stared into the waves. "Are there more?" Walt said. Ranger knew Walt wasn't talking to him, but he understood one word: more. That was a command from Ranger's search and rescue training. Sometimes, when he was practicing to find people trapped in fallen-down buildings, he'd find Luke hiding in a big pipe or under a wooden box. Usually that meant Ranger's work was done, and it was time to go home. But sometimes Luke or Dad would point him back to the rubble and say, "Find more." That meant more people needed help, just like they did today. "More! Find more!" Ranger barked again. He raced back into the waves, hoping Walt would follow. He tracked the men's scents to the spot where he'd been before. The salt water splashed into his eyes and stung them, but Ranger dived into the waves again and again. Finally, his paws touched something solid. Ranger lifted his head out of the waves. He barked and barked until Walt came running back into the sea. Walt dragged 2 more men onto the beach. He pounded their chests until they coughed up water and breathed again. Then another man came and helped Walt drag them both through the gunfire to a safer spot. Ranger stayed by Walt's side. When they finally made it out of the gunfire and into the ditch, Walt leaned back and looked up at the sky, breathing hard. He put a hand on Ranger's neck and ruffled his wet fur. "You had my back out there, didn't you, dog?" Ranger leaned into Walt and waited for something to happen. He could see his first aid kit half buried in the sand in the ditch along with someone's pack. He found a way to help, but the old metal box was still quiet. There was no humming sound, letting him know his job was done. That meant there was more work to do before he could go home. The gunfire quieted for a moment, but then a new sound filled the sky. A buzz, and then a growl of airplanes. 2 of them roared overhead. The planes passed over a ridge and disappeared. There was a whistle, then an enormous blast. Even far away, it shook the sand under Ranger's paws. Smoke and dust rose into the sky. What had happened? Ranger's skin prickled, and he knew his work wasn't done. He scrambled out of the ditch and raced over the beach toward the ridge. So here we have Walt and Ranger. Chapter 6, A Promise Kept. Ooh, I wonder, maybe Walt's gonna promise Ranger something? I don't know, we'll have to see. Ranger ran up the beach, dodging sharp bits of metal that jutted out of the sand. The air was full of smoke and noise. At the bottom of a steep hill, Ranger came to a tiny box of a house, made of concrete. The skin on his neck prickled. The windows of the building had guns instead of glass. The men inside wore clothes that were different from Walt's, different from the other men on the beach. Ranger crouched low and slipped past them, behind the building and up the hill. His paws slipped in the mud, but he climbed to the top. A village spread out in the gray morning light. Its streets were lined with small shops and houses and a little stone church. At the edge of the village, thick smoke rose from a heaping pile of rocks and timbers. Ranger raced down the hill through the weeds and brush. Prickler bushes grabbed at his fur, but Ranger pushed through until he came to a big field with another ditch full of people. They were quieter and dressed differently than any of the men on the beach. Here there were women and children. Ranger leaped over the ditch at a narrow spot and headed for the billowing smoke. When he got to the rubble pile, he stopped. What is it, a house? Whatever it was, something had crushed it. Were the people who lived there safe out in the ditch? Or was someone trapped underneath the heaps of stone and wood? Ranger stepped carefully into a plank at the edge of the mess. It wobbled, and he had to shift his weight to balance. Somewhere in the mess of crushed furniture and splintered wood, there was a creak and then a thump. The site wasn't stable. Ranger knew from his training that fallen-down buildings were dangerous places to search. Ranger had practiced this kind of searching with Luke and his dad. He'd practiced moving safely over all kinds of surfaces. He'd balanced on planks and walked over old car hoods and bed springs. He crawled through dark tunnels and climbed up ladders. Sometimes he and Luke went to the playground so Ranger could walk over the seesaw. He climbed up and down the metal slide to practice spreading his toes so he wouldn't slip back down. But this was no playground. Ranger leaped into a pile of rocks. He smelled smoke and sharp chemicals, but also a trace of food from the night before, meat and apples and bread. Ranger circled the outside of the pile of the rubble. That way he would be sure to catch the scent of any people trapped in the timbers and stones. He climbed over a pile of boards and down into a low, open space that must have been a kitchen once. A toppled cabinet had sent dishes shattering over the wooden floor. Ranger stepped carefully between the chunks of pottery and jagged shards of glass. The smells were stronger here. That happened sometimes in low places where scents pooled out of the wind. Ranger could smell the same smoke and food, but also a cat. He climbed over the cabinet and sniffed again. Definitely a cat. Ranger made his way around to the edge of the kitchen space. He jumped over what was left of a chimney. Meow! A black and white cat perched on a rough chunk of rock, staring at him. It looked like Ruggles, the cat that lived next door to Luke and Sadie, but this cat's fur was wet and matted. One of its ears was smaller than the other. It wore a tiny bell on a muddy blue ribbon around its neck. So here's Ranger and that cat. Ranger barked at the cat. It didn't move. Then the wind shifted and he caught a new scent of the air. A person smell. Ranger patted carefully around the fallen chimney and sniffed again. The person scent was stronger here. He climbed over another tumbled beam and found a boy curled up in a corner. The boy looked about Luke's age, but his hair was darker and he was a lot skinnier. The boy wasn't trapped under anything, but his eyes were closed. It wasn't safe to stay here, not with bits of the house still settling and falling. Ranger barked, but the boy didn't wake up. Ranger barked again and licked him on the cheek. The boy's face twitched. Ranger pawed at his shoulder until the boy opened his eyes. "Where'd you come from, dog?" he whispered. And then, "Where's Belle?" Ranger didn't know what the boy was saying, but he knew they had to get away from these teetering stones and unsteady beams. He pawed the boy's shoulder until he stood up. "Belle! Belle!" the boy called. There was a jingle from behind them. The boy whimped around and dropped to his knees. "You're here!" All at once the boy was laughing and crying and hugging the not rugless cat. Thank goodness I didn't lose you for good. I kept my promise. He wiped the tears that were on his cheeks. Ranger barked and the boy looked up. Are you lost too, dog? I'm Leo. He patted Ranger on the head with his cat-smelling hand and whispered, It's good that you can't give away secrets. I'm supposed to tell people here that my name is Henry. Who do you belong to? I wonder. The Leo boy stopped talking and stared past Ranger into the sky. Ranger heard a sound that prickled the fur on his neck. It was the quiet buzz from before, getting louder and louder. Ranger looked up. There was no ceiling left in Leo's house, so nothing blocked the chilling view of the sky. 5 more planes soared in formation over the smoking countryside. They were getting closer by the second. We're going to stop there. Have a great day. We'll be back again to continue. Chapter 7 is Smoke and Bombs. So hopefully Ranger can help Leo and his cat. But we think his name is Henry. So have a great Thursday. I'll be back again tomorrow.